Good evening. My name is Dr. Marshall Stevenson. I'm Dean of the School of Education, Social Sciences, and the Arts here at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And tonight we have a special treat for you as we wind down Black History Month. One of our students, Ms. Siani Wells, will formally introduce Dr. Williams. But as we know, we've been celebrating for the last several weeks Black History Month, formerly known as Negro History Week, founded by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the second African-American to graduate from Harvard University. This has been a monumental period of time in our country, especially the last year. Not only have we been affected by a pandemic, but we also have been tortured, literally, by the scenes of African-American men and women victimized by the police departments across this country. Almost every few weeks, we hear a verdict, as we did several days ago, of people held blameless for terrorizing African Americans in this country. Dr. Williams will talk a little bit about that and explain the history, the evolution of the Black experience in this country, how far we've come, but yet how far we have yet to go. At this time, Ms. Siani Wells will come to the podium and introduce our speaker for this evening. Ms. Wells.
Good evening. Dr. Yaruhu Williams is Distinguished University Chair and Professor of History and Founding Director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Williams received his PhD from Howard University in 1998. Dr. Williams is the author of Black Politics, White Power, Civil Rights, Black Power, and Black Panthers in New Haven, Rethinking the Black Freedom Movement, and he is also the editor of A Constant Struggle, African American History from 1865 to the Present Documents and Essays. He is also the co-editor of the Black Panthers, Portraits of an Unfinished Revolution. In Search of the Black Panther Party, New Perspectives on a Revolutionary Movement and Liberated Territory Toward a Local History of the Black Panther Party. Dr. Williams has appeared on a variety of local and national radio and television programs, most notably ABC, CNN, MSNBC, Al Jazeera American, BET, C-SPAN, eBrew Today, Fox Business News, Fresh Outlook, HuffPost Live, and NPR. And he was featured in the Ken Burns PBS documentary, Jackie Robinson, and the Stanley Nelson PBS documentary, The Black Panthers. He is also one of the hosts of the History Channel's web show Sound Smart, a regular political commentator on the Cliff Kelly Show on WVON Chicago. Dr. Williams also blogs regularly for the Huffington Post and is a contributor to the Progressive magazine. Dr. Williams' scholarly articles have appeared in the American Bar Association's Insights on Law and Society, the Organization of American History Magazines of History, the Black Scholar, the Journal of Black Studies, Pennsylvania History, Delaware History, the Journal of Civil and Human Rights, and the Black History Bulletin. Dr. Williams is also presently finishing a new book entitled In the Shadow of the Whipping Post, Lynching, Capital Punishment, and Jim Crow Justice in Delaware 1865 to 1965, under contract with Cambridge University Press. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Williams. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm assuming everyone can hear me there, correct? So we'll get started. Tonight, I want to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement in historical context, and I want to frame it in the context of this language, simply because people refuse to see me, Black Lives Matter in historical context. And I'll explain where that phrase, simply because people refuse to see me, comes from. But to begin with, I want to begin with some conventional wisdom from James Baldwin, who said, "The world changes according to the way people can see it." And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. What I hope to do in the roughly 40 minutes that I have with you this evening is perhaps alter the way that we're thinking about our contemporary moment through the lens of this incredible year that we've experienced for the reasons that Dr. Marshall talked about in the intro to this program. Not only the unprecedented killing of Black and brown persons by police, but the fact that the pandemic has exposed and really forced people to contend with a range of racial disparities, which have deep roots in our history, but which many people up until this moment have been allowed to express blindness toward. And we'll talk about how that's connected this evening. I want to begin with the idea that when we talk about Black History Month, as we wind up African American History Month and we talk about the range of Black history, we have to be clear that wounds produce narratives, that the stories that we tell about the past, the way that we see our contemporary moment is really filtered through the lens of the wounds that communities of color, particularly the African American community, has experienced in the United States. The paradox of American slavery and American freedom. The disdain for humanity that produced the inhumanities we associate with chattel slavery in this country. The promise of the Civil War Reconstruction only to culminate and terminate in the emergence of Jim Crow and Plessy versus Ferguson and the age of Jim Crow. The opportunities presented by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, only to terminate in 2013 Shelby County versus Holder, and then in the aftermath of the murder of Trayvon Martin, and despite the election of the nation's first African-American president, a national Black Lives Matter movement. African Americans, African-American history, in spite of the achievements that we celebrate, has also been about confronting and interrogating the wounds. Now, having said that, I would be remiss if I did not talk about this in the context of our contemporary moment and what we saw on January 6th. I apologize if anybody is disturbed by this being somewhat political, but the reality is it's impossible during African American History 2021 not to frame this in the context of the last year and not to frame it in the context of January 6th. And I say that because we are speaking in the shadow of an important moment in our history where literally, and watching people, insurrectionists, go to Washington, D.C. and storm the Capitol, we were witnessing what I like to call a there goes my everything moment. And I'm taking that concept from a phenomenal book by Jason Sokol entitled There Goes My Everything, White Southerners in the Age of Civil Rights. And although it's a very large book, you can boil it down to this very simple concept. Sokol argues that white Southerners, Americans, woke up in 1945 and the world looked one way. Segregation was the norm, the law of the land. And then literally within the space of a few months, the space of a few years, Jackie Robinson integrates baseball. You have federal equal protection laws that are put into place. You've got the civil rights plank entered into the and offered up as part of the Democratic Democratic Party platform. You've got the Dixiecrats bolting the Democratic Party over the issue of civil rights. Literally, there goes my everything. Everything that they thought they knew about the society in which they lived and their place in it was under assault by virtue of the fact that you had African Americans contending for first-class citizenship in that moment. And the reality is that those types of there goes my everything moments are not unique to 1945. They're not unique to 1865. They're not unique to 1861. They have been part of the American experience and by extension, part of the wound that African Americans have experienced. It's what we saw in this country in the aftermath of the Kenosha incident, where you had NBA players and coaches like Doc Rivers coming out and saying in a very eloquent way, we love this country, but this country doesn't love us back. And on the other side, you've got the response to that that's embodied in what we saw on January 6th. And I say that because if you think about the symbols from January 6th and you tie them to the history of the United States, what we saw those insurrectionists bring to the Capitol have deep roots in American history, and they both are symbols of racial terror and racial oppression. You will often hear people, and I used to live in Delaware, obviously working on a book on Delaware, and I spent a lot of time on Delaware, Maryland shore. And I want to be clear that in driving to Delaware State University, I would pass these Confederate flags. And we now all know that we're in this national conversation about Confederate monuments and taking down Confederate monuments. You will often hear defenders of the Confederate flag try to make the case that it's simple symbol of Southern heritage, right? It's, there's no meaning to it beyond being an expression of Southern pride. But I want to be clear that if we think about this history, there is no worse symbol of denial of the very foundations of American democracy than the Confederate flag. When people make that argument or try to make the argument that the flag is a symbol of Southern heritage, I like to direct them to the history of the moment that produced secession and what the leaders of the Confederacy articulated as the cornerstone of that moment, what they were doing and why they were doing that. And I'll share that with you for just a second. But I don't want to miss the other symbol here, which is the noose. And we all know that the noose has become synonymous with the crime of lynching. It was a symbol of racial terror. It remains a symbol of racial terror. And so for the insurrectionists to bring these things to the Capitol and to make them the symbols of that moment are powerful, because what it does is not only speak to the wound that I was talking about with you earlier, but it also underscores the notion that this is one of those there goes my everything moments, in the sense that for some reason, the shifting political winds in this country, the efforts of activists like Stacey Abrams in removing obstacles to Black political participation in Georgia and elsewhere, have produced an angst that we often associate with a backlash against civil rights and an expansion of democracy in ways that empower people of color, people of African descent in this country. Let me not lose you, but let me show you two other symbols here, one from the Capitol, one from World War II. If we have any doubt about the noose as a symbol of racial terror, think about the way that the National Socialists, the Nazis used this, Hitler used this in Nazi Germany. It's a very ugly political cartoon from a German magazine, a Nazi magazine, which depicts the United States as a place where African Americans face death either in the form of the electric chair or lynching. And so even America's enemies in that moment were saying, arsenal of democracy, give me a break, picking on us about what's happening in our racial policies and the inhumanity that we're displaying toward the Jewish people. Look in your own backyard in terms of what's happening with the American Negro, as they put it. And again, this is why these symbols are so powerful. When we think about the response of African-American women and men to this, we can recall the efforts of people like Ida B. Wells. Ida Wells Barnett, in her book, The Red Record, talked about how lynching was a form of political murder. In fact, I'll share this with you because it's powerful. She wrote, "What are African-Americans lynched for? For all kinds of offenses and for no offenses, from murders to misdemeanors. Men and women are put to death without judge or jury. So that although the political excuse was no longer necessary, the wholesale murder of human beings went on just the same." It's the reason why many people in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd describe that as a lynching. And while I think that we should be careful in terms of our use of political terms and historical terms and applying them to episodes like we see today, there's a power in the fact that George Floyd's life was taken without judge or jury, without sanction or decree, for what was a minor offense. Did he deserve the treatment that he received in that particular context? And Ida B. Wells is speaking to us across time and raising that issue and raising that specter. At the same time, I want to be clear that as this political cartoon shows from the mid-1980s, which was about Mumia Abu-Jamal, the political prisoner from Philadelphia, who for a long time had the live on death row and became an international cause célèbre because of the irregularities associated with his case and his trial. The fact of the matter is that this political cartoonist captured this, calling it the history of lynching. And I want to be clear in interpreting what this cartoonist meant to draw our attention to. He was trying to make the case that whether the injustice that's visited against Black and brown bodies occurs in the cover of night by men who wear robes and hoods because they have to cover their faces, because in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, you had laws on the books that were meant to protect the lives of African Americans. The Enforcement Act of 1870 the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. The injustice was the same in the fact that these men used as their instrument of terror, the noose. And I want to be clear that there's a reason that this cartoon is so powerful, is that if we put in the very center of it episodes of racial violence like lynchings that we can associate, the lynching of George White in Wilmington, Delaware in 1903, or Zachariah Chafee in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, or any other, the Luth lynchings here in Minnesota in 1920. Keep in mind, by the turn of the century, by the 19-teens and 1920s, when you look at images of lynchings and lynch mobs, no one's wearing robes and hoods, which speaks to the failure of Reconstruction. In some sense, in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, Black lives mattered for a moment. We got a 13th and a 14th and a 15th Amendment, Civil Rights Act of 1866, Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, Enforcement Act of 1870, Civil Rights Act of 1875, and yet by 1876, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, Reconstruction is sacrificed on the altar of presidential politics to ensure a victory for the Republican Party, which will leave African Americans in a vulnerable position in the South, subject to the racial terror that we associate with the noose. Just to close the arc on this political cartoon, as we think about books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, lynching can also be viewed in the context of the criminal justice system, and whether today the people who deliver that injustice don't wear white robes, they wear black robes, and the tool or the instrument of that oppression is fabricated evidence, the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, trumped up charges, fabricated evidence, rush to judgment, all white juries. These are still the mechanisms of oppression that color our criminal justice system in the United States. I don't want to lose you, but if we think about it in that way, and this comes to the crux of what I'd like to talk to you about this evening. Thurgood Marshall in 1958, in talking about the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, offered a really powerful statement, which I think speaks powerfully to our contemporary moment. When I was watching the events on January 6th, I kept thinking back to these words of Thurgood Marshall, and I'm going to share them with you this evening, because what Marshall is going to suggest is that African Americans have long been the litmus test for American democracy because they've been struggling with American democracy. Let me share with you what he wrote, what he said. Education, Marshall argued, is not the teaching of the 3 R's. It's not about reading, writing, and arithmetic. Education is the teaching of overall citizenship, to learn to live together with fellow citizens, and above all, to learn to obey the law. Marshall continued, I do not know of any more horrible destruction of the principle of citizenship than to tell young children in Little Rock that those of you that withdrew rather than go to school with Negroes, come back, all is forgiven. You win. Therefore, I'm not worried about Negro children in these states. I worry about the white children in Little Rock who are told as young people that the way to get your rights is to violate the law and defy the lawful authorities. I'm worried about their future. I don't worry about the Negro kids' future. They've been struggling with democracy long enough. They know about it. What was really powerful to me in the aftermath of January 6th was the specter of these insurrectionists storming the United States Capitol with no concern and no regard for consequences. And we all know, you heard many pundits say it in the aftermath, that if those had been African Americans, people of color that had engaged in that action, then there would have been calls for all types of punishment and retribution for what we witnessed in, as Nancy Pelosi put it, the despoiling of the temple of democracy. But I want to be very clear here in talking about this with you, that Marshall was also calling us to recognize that when people aren't punished for that behavior in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education, the mobs that we saw that attempted to keep 9 Black children from entering Central High and Little Rock, the governor of Virginia closing Virginia public schools for a year rather than seeing them reopened on an integrated basis in accordance with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, the violence and chicanery that accompanied the Brown decision. What Marshall was saying is that those things would be carried out by the future generations that could look back and anticipate no consequences for similar behavior. But African Americans are left with the specter of a government in that moment that although it had pushed for Brown versus Board of Education, failed to realize the fruits of that in that moment. When Marshall says that African Americans have been struggling with democracy long enough, I want to be clear that we can see that in the in our contemporary moment. We see that African Americans struggling with democracy, not only in the faces of those crowds that assaulted those 9 Black children in Little Rock. We see that in the murder of George Floyd. We see that in the response to Colin Kaepernick. We see that in the response to Ahmaud Arbery and to Breonna Taylor and so many other, in the disparate response in communities of color to COVID-19 and the racial disparities that inform that response. When Marshall says that, he's reminding us that the problem here is that this is a repudiation of American core democratic values, that African Americans, communities of color, have always had to deal with the fact that while the National Council for the Social Studies says that these are core democratic values that every elementary student should know, if we just look at the first one, for communities of color, for African Americans, our daily existence, as Dr. Stevenson laid out in his intro, is every couple weeks being reminded, life, each citizen has the right to the protection of their life. But does that mean stand your ground in Florida? Does that mean Philando Castile? Does that mean that every several weeks we watch some Black or brown person killed in public space, and the response is that from at least the African American community is a national movement around Black Lives Matter? I want to be clear in saying this because as we think about this, excuse me just a second. Apologize. So we think about this, I want to remind you of a Black Lives Matter moment in the response of 13-year-old Melba Patilla Beals, who was the youngest of the Little Rock Nine, who experienced what Marshall was talking about in terms of that backlash. And I want to be clear, at least talking about Melba Patilla Beals, that she was 13 years old, and as this was happening, her mother told her, baby, keep a diary because you're living through history. And so she did. And I want to share this with you because often when we think about this moment, what impact it's having on all of us, my question is, what impact is it having on young people who witnessed the backlash against peaceful protesters this summer, and then the relatively mild treatment of insurrectionists this winter, who witnessed efforts at voter suppression this summer, and then watched insurrectionists storm the Capitol because they were dissatisfied with the results of a fair and democratic election in which there was unprecedented participation by people of color, by African Americans, in which the African American vote, thanks to activists such as Stacey Abrams, turned the tide for the Democratic Party. But I say that because, and I'm thinking about this in terms of young people in this moment, how will they come away from 2020-21, and what will they be struggling with as a result of what happens in this moment? I want you to think about this in the context of Melba Patilla Beals. She writes in her diary on New Year's Eve, 1958, how strange I thought to be involved in something the whole nation considers among its 10 most important stories. If it's that important, you'd think somebody would do something to make the Central High students behave themselves. Is it that nobody cares or nobody knows what to do? See, when I hear Melba Patilla Beals, I sometimes think about last summer and young people asking, how strange it is that George Floyd is among the nation's 10 most important stories. If it's that important, Breonna Taylor, if it's that important, Ahmaud Arbery, if it's that important, Sandra Bland, if it's that important, Tamir Rice, if it's that important, Michael Brown, if it's that important, you'd think somebody would do something to make the police behave themselves. Is it that nobody cares or nobody knows what to do? But don't lose me here. But Melba Patilla Beals goes on to say, by New Year's Eve, I only thought about Central High perhaps every other hour. And so she says, on New Year's Eve, 1958, I sat home contemplating or completing my list of New Year's resolutions. Number 1, to do my best to stay alive until May 29th. Now, May 29th for her was the end of the school year. We sometimes forget that those 9 students in Central High, there was no guarantee. The National Guard couldn't protect them, particularly the young women, the girls, in those spaces where the guardsmen couldn't go. They had no expectation that this experiment would end peacefully with the graduation of Ernie Green. They had no expectation. In fact, you can see the fear that Melba Patilla Beals articulates here. And I would say this to you, because it speaks to us across time. Again, this is a Black Lives Matter moment during the civil rights movement that speaks powerfully to our contemporary moment, which is why we can't escape the shadow of January 6th in terms of Black History Month this year, in terms of this larger history. In fact, I'd read the rest of these to you because they're powerful, but not where I want to focus today. I want to talk a little bit more about Little Rock, because when we think about the response of the President of the United States, 1957 and 2021 are a study in contrasts. So we can see what happened at the US Capitol. We can credit the president in 1957, Dwight David Eisenhower, for coming out strongly and immediately overruling Governor Faubus in Arkansas and taking the same National Guardsmen who on one day had been there, called out by the governor to prevent those 9 children from entering Little Rock High, being nationalized the next day by the President of the United States to protect those 9 children for going into Little Rock High. But it's interesting the justification that Eisenhower gives for this, and I'll share a little bit of this. He begins by saying that proper and sensible observance of the law is needed. And then he goes on to talk about how the foundation of the American way of life is a national respect for law. But what he's really concerned about is how the eyes of the world, how the international community is going to respond to Little Rock. In the same way that we saw in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, the international community looking at the United States and saying, well, kind of resonating with what was happening here, occasioning conversations about the legacy of colonialism and racial injustice in France and in Great Britain, in other spaces. I went on Australian television shortly after George Floyd was murdered here. And shortly after my appearance, several activists contacted me via social media, and they said, thank you for coming to share what's happening in Minneapolis. But oh, by the way, we want you to know that your struggle is our struggle, because here in Australia, since 2003, almost 450 Indigenous people have died in police custody, including the most recent, a gentleman who died on Christmas Eve, and his last words were, "I can't breathe." We know your struggle. We identify with your struggle. And I share that with you because, again, when we go back to Eisenhower, as this political cartoon aptly captures, is more concerned about what the world will think. In fact, he says, in the South as elsewhere, citizens are keenly aware of the tremendous disservice that's being done to the people of Arkansas in the eyes of the nation, and that is being done to the nation in the eyes of the world. He continues, at a time when we face grave situations abroad because of the hatred that communism bears toward a system of government based on human rights, it would be difficult to exaggerate the harm that is being done to the prestige and influence, indeed to the safety of our nation and the world. Our enemies are gloating over this incident and using it everywhere to misrepresent our whole nation. We are portrayed as a violator of those standards of conduct which the peoples of the world united to proclaim in the Charter of the United Nations. But I want to be clear here. What Eisenhower is saying in defense of the nation actually was true. The one group he didn't mention, the one class he didn't mention in this, were the 9 children, the Black lives that literally were in jeopardy, including Melba Patilla Beals, follow me here, struggling with democracy. Look, as we celebrate Black History Month, we know that it's important for us to mark the achievements of prominent people of color, from athletics to technology to science and industry. And one of those is Jackie Robinson. But we know by default, because of that struggle with democracy, that every person of color by default is drafted into the movement. And Jackie Robinson in May of 1958 writes to President Dwight David Eisenhower after hearing him speak. And I want to read this to you because it's powerful, because if you only think about Jack Robinson as a baseball player, you miss the fact that Jack Robinson was also deeply concerned about what was happening. And again, this is one of those Black Lives Matter moments in the longer history of the United States. He writes Eisenhower and he says, my dear Mr. President, I was sitting in the audience at the summit meeting of Negro leaders yesterday when you said we must have patience. On hearing you say this, I felt like standing up and saying, oh no, not again. I respectfully remind you, sir, that we've been the most patient of all people. When you said we must have self-respect, I wondered how we could have self-respect and remain patient considering the treatment accorded us through the years. Mr. President, 17 million Negroes cannot do as you suggest and wait for the hearts of men to change. We want to enjoy now the rights that we feel we're entitled to as Americans. This we cannot do unless we pursue aggressively goals which all other Americans achieved over 150 years ago. And he concludes, and again, I want you to think about this in the shadow of January 6th. I want you to think about this in the shadow of last November. I want you to think about this in the shadow of last summer. I want you to think about this in the shadow of today. As the chief executive of the nation, I respectfully suggest that you unwittingly crush the spirit of freedom in Negroes by constantly urging forbearance and give hope to the pro-segregationist leaders like Governor Faubus, who would take from us even those freedoms we now enjoy. Your own experience with Governor Faubus is proof enough that forbearance is not eventual integration is the goal the pro-segregationist leaders seek. And what told in that? The very symbols of the pro-segregationist leaders, the Confederate flags and the nooses. I want you to take a look at the cartoon on the left that was produced by Herb Block, a very powerful political cartoon from 1958. It pictures Uncle Sam talking to Eisenhower, who's wearing the hat of the chief of the fire department. If you look out the window, you can see the nation in flames over civil rights. And Eisenhower is saying to Uncle Sam, tisk, tisk, somebody should do something about that. And you can almost imagine from his expression that Uncle Sam's response is, but you're the president. You should do something about that. And at the same time, when there was that inaction or inactivity in Washington, that confusion, that indifference, that lack of political will, the people who were doing something were the African-American women and men, people like Daisy Bates, the head of the Arkansas NAACP, people like Ella Baker, the activists, people like the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and John Lewis, nameless, faceless civil rights activists across the country who were committed to that struggle with democracy for the greater good, even in our contemporary moment when we think about this. It's important for us to reflect on the fact that often those encounters come in the space of Jim Crow justice and violence, but the reality is that it's a much broader conversation. In fact, if we think about how Martin Luther King framed it in the aftermath of the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Martin Luther King spoke of our collective responsibility to challenge these types of injustices. You could almost see Dr. King articulating this in response to the killing of Michael Brown, or in response to the choking murder of Eric Gardner, or in response to the killing of Breonna Taylor or Sandra Bland or Raynette Turner. Dr. King wrote or spoke that day in remembrance of Jimmy Lee Jackson. A state trooper pointed the gun, but he did not act alone. Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician, from governors on down, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam, and cannot protect the rights of its own citizens seeking the right to vote at home. He was murdered by the indifference of every white minister of the gospel who's remained silent behind the safe security of his stained glass windows. And he was murdered by the cowardice of every Black person who passively accepts the evils of segregation and stands on the sidelines in the struggle for justice. Dr. King indicted everyone in that. But last on the list are those struggling with democracy long enough. Look, there are people who have made mischaracterizations about the connection between January 6th and last summer and how it's no different than what we saw last summer. But last summer's protests, demands for Black Lives Matter, demands for reimagining policing, demands for addressing health disparities, ultimately weren't about dismantling or destroying American democracy. They were about reforming American democracy, making it work for all people, achieving what Christopher Eisgruber at Princeton calls a just democracy. And at the end of the day, those lazy characterizations defy the history, the process of historical recovery that tells us that across time, and I want to be clear, I shouldn't be able to make these connections if they're not real. That as we talked about Colin Kaepernick and former President Trump took aim at the NFL over them kneeling, it's no different than what was happening in 1968, where if you think about the protest at Mexico City at the Olympic Games and Tommy Smith and Juan Carlos and their protests, what did those symbols, because symbols matter, what did those symbols mean? Black sock feet without shoes to highlight Black poverty, the same stifling poverty that exists here in Minneapolis, which is as much a part of the George Floyd story as Officer Chauvin's knee on his neck. Beads to symbolize lynchings. Well, if we expand our definition of lynchings to include police killings and other forms of violence and terror visited on communities of color, then it's the same concept. Black gloved fists to represent their solidarity and support with Black people, and listen carefully, oppressed people around the globe, conscious internationals, and what I was describing to you earlier when I said you saw the Floyd protest in some sense become global as a response to global white supremacy and a desire to dismantle systemic systems of oppression which have their roots in colonial anti-Blackness. To end with today, I want to talk a little bit about why Black History Month, why what Carter Woodson did in 1926, beginning as Negro History Week, which ultimately became Black History Month, is so important. Because without historical recovery, we're in the danger of assuming, as this political cartoon did, that from 2008 when Barack Obama was elected, that just electing or influencing political elections is the sum of this struggle. And it's bigger than that. Adam Zyglis of the Buffalo News chose to depict Barack Obama riding at the front of the bus, and immediately people connect that to Rosa Parks. It's like Barack Obama is the embodiment of, Rosa sat so Martin could, but the problem with that narrative is, what kind of a bus is it? See, Adam Zyglis brilliantly connected Rosa Parks and Brown versus Board of Education. And while Montgomery may have achieved the desegregation of buses, in education, one of the tragedies of last summer, which we have to talk about as a nation, is at the same time we were talking about what Officer Chauvin did to George Floyd, Minnesota lags behind every state in the union in terms of educational outcomes for African-American students. Dead last in the union, even behind Mississippi in educational outcomes for African-American students. It was bigger than an election. It's bigger than the episodes of police violence that we capture on camera. In fact, I would submit to you that in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, when the nation paused to remember Juneteenth or the Tulsa race riot of 1921 or the Duluth lynching of 1920, there's a strain of consistency that runs through that Maya Angelou asked us to remember when she said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but it can be faced with courage and it need not be lived again. We live it again because people have been unwilling to face it with courage. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, I remember being on a public radio program, and a person asked me the question, do you consider the murder of George Floyd a lynching? No, I don't consider it a lynching. I can consider it an act of police violence, and lynching describes a very specific set of contexts. But I will tell you this, they echo. And the reason they echo is if you know anything about the Duluth lynching of 1920, one of the things that happened in that case is that, and I want to be clear, it's something that it shares with Tulsa, Oklahoma. Both Diamond Dick Rowland and the three men who were murdered here in Minnesota were innocent of any crime. In the case of Dick Rowland, if you read the great book, Death in the Promised Land, he accidentally bumped into a white female elevator operator. She screamed. People assumed that he had sexually assaulted her. She denied that happened. He denied it happened. He was taken to jail for safekeeping. A group of black men, armed black men, came to help the sheriff protect the jail because they knew a lynching was possible. The sheriff disarmed them, and when a mob of whites came, the sheriff didn't turn over Dick Rowland until that mob turned their anger on the African-American community, burning Black Tulsa to the ground. In the case of Duluth, two young people are out having a good time. They stay out past curfew. Instead of owning up to what they had done wrong, they went back and concocted a story that 3 African-American circus workers had assaulted the young woman. A lynch mob is formed, and the sheriff in in Duluth, Minnesota, lets it be known by telling his officers, and I quote, "I will not risk one drop of Anglo-Saxon blood in defense of those prisoners." And once that gets out, that mob storms the jail, drags those 3 men out, and hangs them at the nearest light post. no masks, everyone knowing who participated in that violence. Now, the part of that story we don't know is that as we talk about the activism of Black women in particular, in the aftermath of that, Nellie Griswold Francis here in Minnesota single-handedly drafts anti-lynching legislation and leads a campaign to get an anti-lynching law passed in Minnesota. That's the activism. That's the struggle with democracy that we need to know. We need to recognize that it's bigger than the racism that's caught on cell phones. It's about the legacy of redlining. It's about the legacy of police brutality. It's about the legacy importance of recognizing in our contemporary moment what Al Sharpton said in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Al Sharpton, when he came to Minnesota in Minneapolis and eulogizing George Floyd, said something very powerful. He said, George Floyd's story has been the story of Black folks in America. And the reality is, if we think about it in the context of this struggle with democracy, if we think about it in the context of Black Lives Matter, if we think about it in the context of those things that I've suggested to you today, Al Sharpton's right. In fact, if we push it to its conclusion and we think about the metaphor of the knee, how chattel slavery from 1619 to 1865 was its own form of oppressive knee on the neck of communities of color, how the failure of Reconstruction, despite the promise of that moment, ultimately culminates in the age of Jim Crow segregation, the knee, the pain, the trauma of the segregation signs, white and colored, the brutality used to enforce the same. And if we think about our contemporary moment where we are living through the maintenance and persistence of systemic structural anti-Black racism, then absolutely, this has been the story of Black. But at the same time, we have to tell the parallels to that story, the remarkable achievements that have been accomplished by African Americans, and the fact, as I pointed out earlier, their efforts to deepen American democracy in spite of that injustice. We will not only remember 2020 because of the end of Donald Trump, we'll remember it for the political victories that occurred in Georgia and in Pennsylvania and in Arizona and other spaces where organizers, indigenous people and African-American organizers work to undermine those barriers which continue to deny opportunity for communities of color. If we think about chattel slavery then, if we think about the cornerstone speech that I mentioned earlier where Alexander Stephens says, look, the Confederacy is about maintaining white supremacy. If we think about the failure of the Civil War Reconstruction, I want to end with you tonight on the following 3 slides. And I want to begin here because when we talk about the promise of the Civil War Reconstruction, there's perhaps no better representation of it than this political cartoon that was produced in 1863. It's an ugly image, but an important image. And what the cartoonist meant to suggest in 1863 was this. Congratulations, Mr. Lincoln and Republican Party. You just freed 4.5 million slaves. Now what? What's their social status going to be in a republic? What's their political status going to be? What's their economic status going to be? And oh, by the way, Mr. President and Republicans, if you're not prepared to answer those questions in a way that are affirmative of the human dignity and the full rights and citizenship of those individuals, you will have introduced into the republic a source of chaos and conflict that will not be easily resolved. One of the people who responds to that is Thurgood Marshall, who's invited in the aftermath of the Civil War as the debate over the 13th Amendment is raging to address a predominantly white audience at the annual Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. And the speech that Douglas gives is haunting because Douglas is going to foreshadow the next 100 years of US history. Douglas begins his meditation, what shall we do with the Negro? I've had but one answer from the beginning. Do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played the mischief with us. If the apples will not remain on the tree of their own strength, if they're worm-eaten at the core, if they're early ripe and disposed to fall, let them fall. I'm not for tying or fastening them in the tree in any way except by nature's plan. And if they will not stay there, let them fall. And if the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall also. We should not be surprised to see elements of social Darwinism in Frederick Douglass's thinking in this moment because he's a contemporary of Charles Darwin. He's a contemporary of Herbert Spencer. But there's a method to what he's saying here because he's saying, follow him. All I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. Listen carefully. Let him alone. If you see him on his way to school, this is April of 1865. Fast forward to Brown versus Board of Education. Fast forward to Melba Patella Beals in 1957. Let him alone, don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, think about the Freedom Rides. Fast forward 100 years to 1960. If you see him going to the ballot box, fast forward to last November. Let him go, don't disturb him. And in this moment, the predominantly white audience thinks this sounds reasonable. They applaud him. Douglas continues, if you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing a positive injury. He concludes, if the Negro cannot live by the line of eternal justice so beautifully pictured to you in the illustration used by Mr. Phillips, the fault will not be yours. It will be he who made the Negro and established that line for his government. Let him live or die by that. If you will only untie his hands and give him a chance, I think he will live. If you will only let me put him in conversation with Al Sharpton, take the knee off. But he also says, and I want to be clear here, that if you interfere, the fault will be yours. And by that interference, I want to be clear, the tied hands, the knee are the black codes, the poll tax, literacy test, grandfather clause, sharecropping, prop lineage, debt peonage, convict leasing, segregation laws, felony disfranchisement, the school to prison pipeline, redlining, struggling with democracy. I want to conclude with you this evening, and I'm going to skip a couple of slides because we're way over, by talking about a chapter in our history which we celebrated last year that I think is important as we celebrate the impact of Black women in this struggle for democracy. And I won't do this justice, but I'd like to get the question answered, so I'm going to run through this quickly. Last year, as we were celebrating the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, 1920, and lionizing people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, they deserve our respect and admiration for their work. But I want to be clear that when the 15th Amendment granted African-American males, actually the 15th Amendment doesn't grant anyone the right to vote. When it removed restrictions in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude and said nothing about gender, these female suffragists who were once allies with abolitionists, allies with Frederick Douglass, came out hard against it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1869 wrote this piece, gave a speech in which he said, American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement, if you do not wish the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish with their low ideas of womanhood to make laws for you and your daughters, to be your rulers, judges, jurors, to dictate not only the civil but moral codes by which you shall be governed, awake to the danger of your present position and demand that woman too shall be represented in the government. But hold on, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it's not the low orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish that denied the American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement, white women, that's her code, that denied them that right. It was your own husbands, brothers, fathers, sons in the Congress that did that. But she appeals to white supremacy in that moment. This is what white privilege, this is what white supremacy looks like. This is what people are talking about when they use that language. I don't lead with that language, but if you can demonstrate it in the history, then you can show. Now, African-American female suffragists, if this was an appeal, if it was an anti-racist appeal, would have been an appeal for women, period. But African-American female activists like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper in 1866 understood that. In fact, it's a powerful speech. We were all bound up together in May of 1866, 3 years before Elizabeth Cady Stanton, where she lays this out. I'm going to read this to you. This will be our final slide and we'll take some questions. She says, listen, I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. Not about electing Black people to office. It's deeper than that. I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think like men, they, all of us, may be divided into three classes: the good, the bad, and the indifferent. The good would vote according to their convictions and principles. The bad is dictated by prejudice or malice, and the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party. You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in a situation of Ishmael, my hand against every man and every man's hand against me. Let me go tomorrow morning and take a seat in one of your streetcars. I do not know what they'll do in New York, but they will in Philadelphia, and the conductor will put his hand and stop the car rather than let me ride. This is 1866, 100 years before Rosa Parks. I want to be clear that when Thurgood Marshall says that African Americans, that people of color, that people of African descent have been struggling with democracy long enough, and we can see that in the foundations of our history, it's an invitation for us in our contemporary moment to seize the time to reimagine in this moment of reckoning how much more powerful our democracy could be if it lived up to the promise and not the practice. If we recognize that Black Lives Matter moments are an indictment, but also an opportunity on how we can actually achieve that more perfect union. Thank you, and we'll take questions. Oh, no questions. I think we're done. We thank everybody for coming out today and appreciate you participating.